The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I am your host, Hollis Grant. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at the terminology of left and right. Left wing, right wing. What does it all mean? Who's right? Who's left? And why does it matter? So taking an article from dictionary.com, the words left and right are closely associated with differing wings of the political spectrum. But how did liberal policies become associated with the word left anyways? And why are conservatives labeled right? When we discuss the origins of the word, we often warn against origin stories that sound too good to be true. Well, in this case, the history of the terms left and right in the context of politics turns out to be a fascinating exception. In this article, we'll discuss the modern meanings of each term and then delve into the quite literal origins of how words for opposite directions came to be associated with opposing political views. We'll cross the aisle to cover it all: right, left, and center. What does left mean? In politics, the word left is applied to people in groups that have liberal views. That generally means they support progressive reforms, especially those seeking greater social and economic equality. So when it comes down to equality, think socialism. Everybody wants to be equal, and everyone has the same outcome, and everybody is exactly the same. The term far left is often used to refer to those who are considered to have more extreme revolutionary views, such as those who espouse communism and socialism. Collectively, people of groups as well as the positions they hold are referred to as left or left wing. What does right mean? The word right, in contrast, refers to people or groups that have conservative views. That generally means that they are disposed to preserving existing conditions and institutions, or they want to restore traditional ones and limit change. The term far right is often used for more extreme nationalistic viewpoints, including fascism and some oppressive ideologies. People in groups as well as their positions are collectively referred to as right or the right wing. The origin of the political left and right do actually have to do with the physical directions, left and right. Time for a history lesson. Left and right originally referred to seating positions in the 1979 French National Assembly, the Parliament France formed after the French Revolution. Relative to the viewpoint of the speaker, the chair of this assembly, to the right were seated nobility and more high-ranking religious leaders. To the left were seated commoners and less powerful clergy. The right-hand side became associated with the more reactionary views, and the left-hand side with the more radical views. Left and right as political adjectives are recorded in England in the 1790s. Seating positions closer to the center of the 1789 French National Assembly likewise became associated with moderate positions, which is what the word center now conveys in the context of politics. In other words, people who consider themselves in the center favor moderate positions, those not too far toward either end of the spectrum. People holding these views are often called moderates or political independents, often fall at the center of the political spectrum. Center left refers to people, groups, or views that are just to the left of the political center in a country. Center right refers to being a little more to the right of center. Of course, these labels and their interpretations are subjective and vary from person to person and place to place. In the US, people often use left as a shorthand for the Democratic Party and right as a shorthand for the Republican Party. But keep in mind, politics is always far more complicated than the labels we give to it and each other. So now that we have a better understanding of what left and right is, some of the words that are used in today's media, if you're looking to mainstream media or what's referred to as legacy media, then you're going to hear terms of nationalism and how nationalism is a bad thing, or you'll hear these types of words that are thrown out. Now, what is nationalism? Now, according to dictionary.com, nationalism is the spirit or aspirations common to the whole of a nation. Devotion and loyalty to one's own country, also patriotism. Excessive patriotism, chauvinism. The desire for national advancement or political independence. The policy or doctrine of asserting the interests of one's own nation viewed as separate from the interests of other nations or the common interests of all nations. So keeping the interests of the country. Now, it's good to be one energy independent. I know as the hot topic issues getting into winter, especially with Europe and the lack of fuel and the soaring cost of oil, natural gases that are going up, mainly due to the shutting down or the disabling of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia, the Russian-Ukrainian war that stopped and limited fuel going into Europe, Europe's desire to push ahead to a green energy and not using fossil fuels, or going ahead not thinking that these changes were too fast and too quick. Then getting into the United States, where there's now a loss of energy and problems that happened with the Keystone Pipeline, the less fracking, the less drilling for oil, although the plans or the permits that the White House keeps on saying that they allowed more permits fall under the last administration. But there's no new drilling and nothing's happening. And the reserves are drying up. And Joe Biden recently went to Saudi Arabia to ask for more oil, and that was since rejected. So when you look at as a whole and think, okay, well, I'm reliant as a nation, I'm reliant on Saudi Arabia. I'm relying on Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, not a friendly country. Saudi Arabia, not necessarily a friendly country either. I need to import oil, but we're also sitting on a ton of oil, and we have a lot of oil, and we have a lot of oil that we would gather, but we don't want to dig it up because insert reason. The nationalistic approach would be, no, we need to take care of our own. We need to make sure that our people have access to the materials that they need. And we'll dig up the oil, or we'll frack the oil. We'll do it, and we'll make sure that it's done correctly and safely. And we don't want any underground fires that happen, such as the one in Pennsylvania, which, if you're familiar with video games, it was based on the game Silent Hill, was based on real-life events of a coal town in Pennsylvania where poor planning, poor mining, and poor standards led to a horrific accident to which these coal veins under the ground are still burning to this day. So you want to make sure that you take care of your own people. You want to take care of everything. And what happened and where things sort of fell off the rails in the 1970s is manufacturing slowly left. Companies decided to sell out and go to China. And in the 80s, more manufacturing left down to Mexico. The NAFTA agreement. Mexico quickly lost their jobs over to China, over to India. Most manufacturing is done not in the United States. And the problem there becomes you're no longer making the items at home. You're now stuck waiting on the global supply. And if anything, any learning lesson came out of COVID was the supply chain and how quickly the supply chain can break down. And it's a fundamental problem is when you're taking these businesses and you're allowing them to operate in your country, and the business isn't accountable to any law, and the business is run by people that say, well, we need to maximize profit. And the way that we can maximize profit is if we make this widget over in China for 10 cents a day, whereas if I manufacture it here in the state of New York, I'm subject to environmental assessments. I'm subject to state taxes, to federal taxes. I now have to pay my employees a minimum wage when I can just get us made cheaper overseas. So I'll pay someone to make it and I'll just ship it in. The nationalistic approach would be, well, hold on a second. We need to make sure that our people are working, and we need to make sure that our people aren't without. And company, you shouldn't be able to move out. You shouldn't be able to leave. And politicians didn't do any of that. Of course, they said, yeah, sure, go ahead, and that's not a problem. And off they went, and China became a superpower, and they are what they are today, all because politicians did not stand up to corporations and in terms of greed, corporate greed, and chasing the almighty dollar. But on the flip side, in that definition that we looked at, to the left, we looked at the term socialism, something that we hear. What is socialism? It's a theory or system of social organization that advocates the ownership and control of the means of production, distribution, capital, land, by the community as a whole, usually through a centralized government. Procedure or practice in accordance with this theory. In Marxist theory, the stage following capitalism in the transition of a society to communism, characterized by the imperfect implementation of collectivist principles. Think big government. If you think centralized government, for those of you that have had lived under communist countries and that you've since moved out of those communist countries, good for you. I've had the opportunity to travel to former communist countries, and 20 years after their revolutions, they're still feeling the impact of this centralized government. Having government control the land, having government control distribution of products, distribution of food, controlling who can and cannot live on land. And if anything, if you're looking from the last 2 years, COVID is going to be your prime example to look at how quickly the people can lose control to the government. Because we got into excessive lockdowns, which we now know didn't do any good. We get into excessive mask mandates, which we now know, based on information, didn't really do any good. We get into really bad policies coming down to vaccination, who can and cannot do anything in society, which we now know wasn't necessarily a good idea. Because the people in these former communist countries have no choice. When the government fails to produce food, it's not the government that goes without. It's not the people in power that goes without. And if you're part of the centralized government, you'll always be fine. But it's the regular people that go without. People that come from former communist countries that have lived in there have a mistrust that's so ingrained into their cultures that they do not trust government and they do not trust their own people. And this is generational. This is now gone to another generation where there is a mistrust still to this day of government officials. Now, as we head into election time, the midterm elections are coming up in America. The Canadian election, federal election, is looming, and they're preparing for the election process to happen. Keep in mind when you hear politicians talking about left wing and right wing and use terms extremist, and they'll throw terms like Nazis and fascist and commies. Keep in mind really what it comes down to and the key policies that are being talked about. One, about protecting your own country's national interests and making sure that your country is safe before you can help others. And the other hand, let's talk about a global community and opening up the country and allowing more people to come in and having a free ease of movement around. Because a lot of people on the left are people that are supported by the World Economic Forum that has, and we've talked about on this show before, go back to droidscanada.com and you can see all of our past episodes. You can hear about the World Economic Forum. And the World Economic Forum believes in a open society, a world government for the ease of everybody. And everything will be easier because it's open. And on the other side, you have the other politicians saying, hold on a second, we don't want to buy into this. And this is fundamentally what the future of politics is coming down to. All the minor little distractions are here to distract you as a voter and distract you from what the big picture really is. As always, we welcome any type of feedback that you have. Follow our Facebook or Twitter page. I'd like to thank you again for listening in. You have yourself a great week. And thank you for listening to The Fact Is. And I'm your host, Hollis Grant.
Salsa shark! We're gonna need a bigger boat! Throughout history, they have been a part of our Canadian life. Men and women who have made their mission to entertain their fellow man. They've worked hard enough. Isn't it time they had their own podcast?
Droids Canada. This podcast would be great if it wasn't for the internet trolls.
I don't bother them and they don't bother me.
I could do without the bad reviews in the iTunes store.
You have that podcast with that guy who was at that Comic-Con in the last year.
You should hear the barrage of the stupid questions I get on our SoundCloud account.
What do you mean there was coughing? How am I going to hear a podcast with coughing?
You feel a lot better if you just rip into the occasional guest.
You're a host who doesn't get paid. You can't just do anything you want while you're recording.
What kind of podcast are you running here anyways?
Droids Canada Podcast present.
You think anyone can see us down here?
Why, you think you want to have sex or something?
Can we?
Droids Canada Podcast. The only show to rip off a Clerks trailer.
You hate people!
But I love Comic-Cons. Isn't it ironic?